Um, Hi, good afternoon. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and I'm Peruvian, so I was particularly interested in what's going on in think tanks in Latin America. And I worked for, or with, a few of them before I came over to the UK, and I continue to work with them. And so some of the issues that have come out in the previous presentation resonate with think tanks. So I'm going to try to talk about two key things. Trying to think about what are think tanks in Latin America, what do we talk about when we talk about think tanks over there. And second, what is what think tanks are talking about right now, partly because of this index, and partly because of the things that have made them think about themselves and about how they engage with their own context. So I want to talk about first the function of think tanks, and I'll move away from trying to define it, and I'd rather try to describe it. The evolution of what seem to be hybrids, forms that are not necessarily any particular sort, but seem to be very common in the region. The problem with visibility, which is what we talk about with our think tank partners a lot. We keep talking about how do we get our work to be visible? How are we visible in the political, national, international space? And then some conclusions. So my main arguments are going to be that while visibility is crucially important, it doesn't necessarily translate into substantive influence, but substantive influence is far more important than visibility, and how it's going to happen is likely to be through non-traditional or these hybrid type of organizations in developing countries, and in this case I'm going to draw from Latin America. I focus on visibility again, as I said, because this is the kind of conversation that we in ODI are having with some of our partners in the region. They're interested to know how they communicate. I also want to highlight that I'm not going to talk about international development think tanks like ODI or Center for Global Development, or I'll put IDS into the group. We have a very weird situation where we're talking about somebody else's policies in developing countries. I'm going to talk about think tanks in developing countries who are dealing with policies in their countries, who are more likely to be compared with think tanks in the UK or in the US as well. And this is the big debate I've had within ODI, so not everybody agrees. So think tank functions. From the work we did in Latin America, we came out with these roles, these functions that think tanks are playing in the region. And this is not just looking at them independently, but looking at them in relation to political parties. So we looked at think tanks in Latin America, in Peru, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Chile, and in Uruguay to some extent. And we asked, how do they relate with political parties? And what came out of this is that they fulfill these functions. First, they seek support for policies. I think that's quite straightforward. They put forward ideas and they try to seek support from different policymakers or the media or general public. But also they act as legitimizers of policies. They legitimize the policies that somebody else has come up with. And this is quite clearly happening in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and Peru. The alliances being developed between Evo Morales' government and organizations that are acting as think tanks that are doing research is clearly that, to legitimize the particular policies that the government have already decided on. The spaces for debate, sounding boards, they're called them in Ecuador. And in Chile, it's particularly interesting because during the time of the dictatorship in the 70s with Pinochet, there were quite a few think tanks set up. And this was a safe space for the left-wing policymakers or intellectuals to go and do some research into the protection of the organization, partly because they were getting money from international corporations. They're financial channels for political parties themselves. So if you want to support a political party, you don't want to get involved in politics, think tanks are being used in this way. And they also they provide these cadres of experts for government when the new sort of democratic government came in Chile and in Peru in the 1990s. In Peru in 2000 and in Chile in the 1990s. The heads of think tanks and the heads of departments in think tanks left the think tanks and moved over to the government. And in general, this is something that constantly happens. In Peru, in the last 3 years, vice ministers of finance, the head of the central bank have all come from think tanks and come and go in this respect. So they fulfill these types of functions, and you can see now already that some organizations, lots of different types of organizations can fulfill these roles. And this is what came out of the research that was done in these countries. So these can be played by different types of organizations, and I'm going to talk about 3 reasons why this might happen, 3 reasons why we might have lots of different types of organizations. First, the origin of think tanks in the region, their interaction with the political space, and then the evolution of the context in which they've been created. The first thing to say is that they have quite unique origins. I don't know if you see that, but that is a paper from 1791. It's called El Mercurio Peruano, and this is published by the Academic Society of Lovers of the Country, or Amantes del País. This is something that was inherited from Spain, and these are academics, intellectuals who got together and discussed the ideas around independence in 1700. This is replicated later on during the time of building the Republic, and the first mention of think tanks in the Colombian research that was undertaken refers to this, refers to these groups of academics that come together to discuss issues and publish these kind of newspapers or journals to discuss the formation of the Republic in the late 1800s. So that's important, is that they emerge as part of the political struggle. They don't emerge as an independent academic group who want to inform policy. They emerge to inform the political process. The second thing is that they have very close relations with political actors. They're very linked. When the political parties, the traditional political parties, fell in Bolivia, when Evo Morales came in with a new way of government and new ideas of democracy, think tanks associated with these parties disappeared and collapsed. Why? Because they were closely linked with them. In Colombia, there are many examples of leaders or challenges to the leadership setting up their own political think tanks to develop the argument that they're going to use within their parties or in the general sort of political sphere. And this is also quite common in Uruguay. So the link between political parties, political actors, and think tanks is very close. And so what happens to political systems affects what happens to think tanks themselves. And you can see that the most stable political systems in the region, Chile, Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, have strong think tanks as well, where the least stable ones, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, have very weak think tanks. And then finally, as I said before, the evolution of the context affects the evolution of think tanks. So think tanks set up during the Pinochet regime were very left-leaning, were dealing with human rights, with human development. The ones who were set up after the Pinochet regime were dealing with market policies, trying to protect the policies that were set up before. And those who were set up after 10 years of sort of consultation and sort of democratic stability had to deal with two parties that were not really fighting each other anymore, and set up networks, set up foundations, set up cross-party organizations. And this is the same in the U.S. If you look at the U.S., the revolution of think tanks, you see at some point Industrial Revolution donors having this progressive belief in science, or setting up centers of scholar excellence. Then there's a bit of social disaffection, so you need to engage in politics a little bit more. Second World War brings complex foreign policy and military strategy demands, so think tanks cannot just sit back and do some nice scholarly work. And it slowly becomes about politics, and it becomes quite ideological as well, and it's about the ideological think tanks. And you see this in terms of who is setting them up, sort of philanthropy in academia, dealing with policy, so people already involved in sort of ideological groups, and finally people who are already involved in politics, who are already involved in the sort of in the Capitol Hill space, and dealing with political parties and with interest groups. So it shouldn't surprise us that if they have different origins, particular origins, and they interact so closely with their context, that develops in so many different ways, and that they're very linked to that context that is changing, that these think tanks are, and they look quite like hybrids, and they can come in all different types of shapes and forms. So you have NGOs in Bolivia acting as think tanks, fulfilling the same roles, the same functions that any think tank in a more developed country would. We could say they're not specifically think tanks, but they fulfill the same roles. You have internal think tanks in Colombia all over the place. You have traditional think tanks in Chile, quite a few of them, yes. You have international academic networks like Flaxo, who is mentioned as a think tank in each country, but is actually part of an international network. And you have think tank networks like CIES in Peru, that is effectively providing that kind of work. And some of the work in Peru was quite interesting. because there's no trust between policymakers and think tanks, you have technocratic networks that develop in between them. So that's where the influence happens, in that space between think tanks and political parties. The second point I wanted to make was to do with visibility, because this discussion about best think tanks or top think tanks, or what is a think tank, and the issue that there's so much more money around for think tanks in developing countries, has had a few of the organizations we work with asking us about how can we be more visible. Basically, that's what they want to know. They want to know how can they get their work out there, how can they become a reference point for policymakers, for donors, when they look at their country or their region. So visibility can be a very good thing. It can lead to a lot more funds, definitely, and it can lead to a lot of influence. If you are the first person that is told, then you will probably have a lot of influence. But the visibility effort can undermine the capacity to bring about substantive influence. I have a much longer presentation about this, so I'm not going to get into it. But I want to suggest that there are these sources. There are more think tanks, and not just more think tanks as defined as think tanks. And we could argue that we should. But more think tanks, more organizations calling themselves think tanks. In some of the studies, the authors do that. The authors actually say self-defined think tanks when describing a particular think tank. And there are more because, of course, there's more money from donors and from organizations wanting to work with them. So these donors and organizations are not just interested in the influence or the change, they're interested also in voting for money and showing that they've been supporting these organizations. There's more competition to show that you're doing this. And therefore there's more marketing-oriented strategies. And a lot of the organizations we work with want to do that. And ODI is a clear example of wanting to be more able to communicate, get its ideas out there, stream the presentations and the debates, etc., be out there. But there might be a trade-off between this, between more commentary, between more opinions, between more blogs, between more being in the news today, with a long-term and expensive work of doing estimates, options of policies, proposals for policy, long-term work, that actually is what brings about that substantive change that we want. It will bring more visibility, it will bring us more money, but it might lead to less substantive change. And this is actually what happens more truthfully for developing countries, where the resources, although there are more for think tanks, they're limited in the way they can be allocated. So you get money to do something, but you can't really decide to spend a lot of time on the research if what you're constantly being asked to do is show how your research is getting to the media, how your research is getting into policymakers' desks and into their offices, etc. This has definitely happened. We have more money, and we have think tanks that are more interested in communicating their work and getting it out there and being quite visible. So they're facing some challenges. First, a challenge to do with the fact that funding can make demands on the strategy. It can demand that you invest more money in communications rather than on research. Although it doesn't necessarily say it, but it can create those incentives. Visibility can detract from that substantive influence and even reduce credibility, because as we see in the Latin American examples, because you're so close to the government, because you're close to these policymakers and politicians and political parties, because you need to be in the media every day, then when the media changes its attention, or when the political parties collapse, or which is quite often, and then you can fall down with them as well. And so it's quite a risky strategy. The other thing is that there is limited resources, so developing communication competencies may undermine research competencies. And these are very different. And researchers, and we see this across ODI a lot, researchers are not the best communicators. They're not the best going out and talking and convincing people. And they require the resources to do good research. They require access to academic work, they require access to databases, they require tools to do that kind of work, and we need to protect that. And finally, and this is something that comes out particularly from the case of Bolivia and Ecuador, is that by moving in that direction, we might face new competition, and competition we're not going to beat. People can demand. And in ODI we say that we need to have a message, that you can shout at the back of a bus, very clear, 10 seconds, you can read it or you can hear it and you'll know what's happening. These are protesters in Bolivia, and protesters in Bolivia can do the same. They can provide you some context and historical analysis. They can tell you what's been happening in their country for the last 179 years. They can give you a problem definition as well, and they can provide some policy recommendations in a very simple manner. And they can actually threaten you, because that's a threat down there. So they might actually be very convincing towards policymakers, and they can vote. And I think that's something that might be happening to some of the organizations we're working with, is that by trying to get into that debate, that public debate, they might be getting too close to that space of the, that belongs to the general public, belongs to the voters, belongs to the organizations who represent a vast number of people, and who are not necessarily trying to advocate for a policy based on evidence, which is what think tanks should be doing. But also the other point of who knows us is very important. And so thinking about visibility for the sake of visibility is quite important. And this is my only direct reference to the index. As a Peruvian, I thought, let me look at the Peruvian think tanks. And the think tanks included are Apoyo in the long list of I think 407 organizations. Apoyo, ILD, IEP, etc. ILD is particularly obvious. This is the Hernando de Soto think tank. And Hernando de Soto is well known for his policies on SMEs and reducing red tape, etc. But you could argue that Hernando de Soto should actually be, his think tank should be a global think tank, because he does a lot more work outside Peru than he does. These are all known, respected, but it doesn't include other organizations which are equally or more known and respected and influential. And of course, it's who you ask and who gets the information that might be able to suggest who they are. The Instituto de Gobierno is a recent one. It's quite new, and it's within a university, but it's a center, just like UPC would be. And it was proposed by Alan Garcia, who is the current president. And so, if you ask anybody what is the most influential think tank in Peru, they'll say Instituto de Gobierno. They are the ones who are talking to the president and his government quite on a regular basis. And the other political parties, the other groups have their own links to these organizations. So who we ask is going to be quite important. So for a think tank to try to be quite visible and use its resources to just become the leading think tank in international development in the UK might be actually counterproductive to their strategy. So visibility might lead to substance if we use the funds for both short-term demand-driven analysis, long-term focus to engage with policymakers and politicians, both for visibility and for substantive impact. This is not impossible. We're going to have to convince donors, though, that the money we get through visibility should be invested in long-term problem-focused research. That will help us engage and bring about substantive impact. And that's, I think, going to be the difficult part of the equation. But what's happening right now is we're focusing on that. So some non-negotiables that come out of my reading of the research that has done in Peru, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Colombia, etc., and also from what comes out of the index itself and the sort of the study around it, is that we can't get away from the fact that we have to command high quality research for substantive enterprise. We're not going to be very influential, even if we are at the top of the list. If we are called and we don't have the research to do that, and the resources need to be protected. Think tanks have to reach policymakers, and this is something that James Mann just said. You have to go. Long gone are the days when they would come to you to ask for information. You have to go to them. You have to engage with them. They have a lot of options, and so they're going to take the option that comes to them. Their policy agendas are far more complex now than they were before. Therefore, they don't have the time, to go around the think tanks of London or Peru or Lima or Buenos Aires or Nairobi to look for that. Second of all is that we have to be visible. Tough. We can't not be visible because the public doesn't mean private anymore. We can't deal with public policy in private anymore. The general public is well informed, far more informed than it was before, and they will demand to know what's going on with the policies. So we're going to have to debate and engage in that public space. But we have to be careful that we're not getting into that space of the general public. We have to come in as think tanks, not necessarily as voters. And we must be credible. That's nothing we can get away from, but that has to do with how we become visible, how we communicate the work, and the kind of research we do. And we must be relevant to our context. And this is what comes out, I think, from the Latin American experience. We cannot be a particular type of organization everywhere. We have to be the organization that fits to the country, to the city, the sector that we're working in. And I think in terms of funding these organizations around the world, Hewlett Foundations and the IDRC, the 100 million program, should be focusing on funding different types of organizations, different arrangements, because they probably work better there rather than what we would think they would work in. And that's it.
Very good. Thank you very much.